Welcome to After Further Consideration, a DEI-focused podcast brought to you by Enrollify and Element 451. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Executive Director of Convergence Strategies and Higher Education faculty member.
And I'm Dr. Tomika Ferguson, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Inclusive Excellence, and an Assistant Professor at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Education. We're sitting down with seasoned change leaders for candid chats about responsive leadership, addressing campus crises, navigating institutional shifts, and fostering sustainable change, all through the lens of equity and inclusion.
Join us every other Tuesday to learn about these leaders' real-life challenges, lessons learned, and the innovative solutions they develop to tackle these complex issues.
Our goal is to help you drive positive and inclusive change on your campus.
After Further Consideration is a part of the Enrollify Network, a community of innovators, thinkers, and doers dedicated to revolutionizing higher education. Learn new skills, find your next big idea, and network with the industry's best minds at enrollify.org.
Enrollify is presented by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.
Today, our guest is Dr. Chris Wren, and I am so excited to talk to you, Chris. Chris is a professor of higher education, adult and lifelong education, and the Mildred B. Erickson Distinguished Chair Emeriti at the Department of Educational Administration at Michigan State University. Chris, your story and the career that you've had is sort of semi-legendary to some of us that have been around you for a while. You've served as a policy analyst, an associate dean and senior advisor to the Dean of Undergraduate Education. You were in the dean's office back at Brown University some years ago, and you have been a staple of the Michigan State higher ed program for almost 20 years now, if we can even believe it. And I'm just so thankful to have you on our episode of After Further Consideration, and just excited to share in the conversation with you. You've served as such a important mentor for me the last 3 years, and I feel so honored that you have joined us today to talk more about your work. So, Chris, as we get into this today, we want to hear a little bit more on your story and how you would sort of introduce yourself to us. Like, what are the sort of like ways in which you think about yourself and like your career and your role? So tell us a little bit more about your story.
Well, thank you so much. And first, thanks, Tomika and Cody, for having me here. This is really exciting to be able to join you in this adventure and to add my voice to the conversation that you are curating nationally for us. So I, like many people who end up in student affairs and higher education, started college as not going into that field. I, like many other people, was pre-med and took all those classes, but also along the way, I went to Mount Holyoke College, a gender diverse women's college. And small at the time I was there were 2,000 students, which meant kind of everybody had to do everything. So I was a student athlete, I was a residence hall leader, I was in the student government, all the things. And along the way, I ended up with some fantastic mentors in that work. And who, like the story is so familiar in the fields, somebody sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, you know, this is a career you could have. So I went into that work and never looked back, not once. I ended up as a dean, associate dean, as you had noted, in the Office of Student Life at Brown University, doing kind of generalist work. The student affairs setup at Brown at the time was very generalist. So I, over time, worked with women's peer counseling, which was a residentially based program. I worked with disability student services when we were just starting that, before we knew that that was like a real job that lots of people should be doing and nobody should be doing as a third of their other job. We were learning. And I was inaugurated the LGBTQ work at Brown University. And I just had a lot of opportunities there. And along the way, I was like, well, you know, if I want to move up in student affairs, I'm probably going to need a further degree beyond my master's. So I looked around. I wanted to stay in New England and I wanted to stay working at Brown full time. I loved that work and I worked with the most amazing people. I looked at some programs I could do while I was working full time. And I chose Boston College for my PhD. Worked with the gifted, wonderful, and now retired Karen Arnold. And partway through my time at Boston College, and I had gone to a pretty non-traditional master's program. And I didn't have in my head a vision of like, oh, there's like faculty in higher ed programs, because that's not what I had. But I looked around at Karen, and Philip Albach was on the faculty there. And I was like, oh, this is like a job you could have. Like I could do that. And I had the opportunity to do research with Karen. And then I was very fortunate to get a Spencer dissertation fellowship, which enabled me to cut my work hours at Brown and to be, quote, just a grad student. And that was transformative, and thinking about like, oh, maybe this is a life I want to try. So like, all right, I will give this a try. Faculty stuff, if I don't love it, I can come back and do the work I completely love in student affairs administration, always knowing that was there as not a backup, but a thing I could keep doing. Became a faculty person at Southern Illinois Carbondale for a couple of years. My partner was still in Boston at the time. And we decided when the position came open at Michigan State, although she did go to the rival University of Michigan, as did her parents. So a little controversial when I took the job down the road in East Lansing. But super exciting to be part of a great higher ed community in the state of Michigan. And I have loved every minute of it ever since. In 2013, my provost at Michigan State invited me back into administrative work. By that time, I was tenured and had been promoted to full professor, and re-entering administrative work, doing student success for the provost office. So I was in academic affairs, not student affairs. As a tenured faculty member, was both shockingly overwhelming, like cry in your kitchen every day before work, overwhelming. 50,000 students, a large public university. You know, the last time I'd been an administrator, I didn't supervise anybody, and it was at Brown, which was private and had like 6,000 students. So it was a big learning curve, and a lot of what I thought was, oh my gosh, I have not been preparing my master's students for this world of work. I need to get better at that. And also every now and then would look around and be like, oh my gosh, this is no way to run a university. And a bunch of these people have PhDs from us. Sort of those realizations, but helped me think about my teaching in different ways. And I did that work from 2013 until just last May in different roles in that office, and have stepped into, quote, just faculty again, because I want to really, the next chapter of my career, dive into the teaching, mentoring, research. I am in administrator withdrawal, but also very grateful to have more time to focus on my students and my intellectual work. So I'm sort of loving that. And that's sort of the pathway that brings me around here. So there've been different leadership roles in different parts of that, but that's kind of the way I end up here today.
You know, it makes me, when I was listening to your story, it makes me think about you almost falling in and out of leadership. And I think that's a choice and sometimes a privilege that folks have and don't have, being in the right place at the right time, demonstrating the competencies for folks to lead. With every time that you've transitioned, you know, back into like administration, was there something that was intrinsically motivating you to make that switch? Or was it just an opportunity that you felt right at that time?
My mom is one of my mentors and one of my all-time favorite role models as a leader. And she, when I was fairly young, taught me that always make decisions that will open more doors. So when you have an opportunity, you see an opportunity, you're offered an opportunity, you create an opportunity, do it in ways that open more doors than they close whenever you have the option. So I would say when I kind of had options, I was like, well, this will open more doors. And you don't always know where the doors are going. But if you continue to open doors that lead to more hallways filled with more doors, you will be able to make more decisions, have more agency or path. Now that comes with privilege, and you know, not everybody has the same set of doors and is offered the same set of opportunities. But when I do have those opportunities, and I encourage my students and colleagues to say, like, if you're making a decision between two positions or two volunteer roles or sort of anything else you're doing, if one of them seems like it will foreclose other opportunities, sometimes there are good reasons to do that. But if the other position might begin to open more things, go with the one that opens more things. So I think that's part of how I have ended up along those pathways. So when I got the call from the then provost, to do the administrative work, I thought, you know, I've been at Michigan State 13 years now. This is interesting. I wonder what it's like to be an administrator when you are also a tenured faculty member. By the way, it's delightful in some ways, because I kept thinking there were some things I could do where I was like, I'm going to do this, and if the provost and president are unhappy with it, like, send me back to that job I love in the college education. fine. If that's the worst thing that happens to me is I end up back in the job I love, I'm cool. So, that kind of opening doors and then understanding where there was like a safety net to be able to do some things.
Yeah, I think, I think hearing that story and about how you navigate it, but also being able to like navigate in the shifts as being a tenured professor is such a different dynamic in a world that we really need sort of activism and voice around change and challenge within institutions. I really appreciate your story too. And I know, in some conversations that you and I have had outside of here about that it wasn't so easy, that the story of Chris Wren that everybody sort of might have heard about and known, that it took a lot of work and effort to end up in these sort of positions. And I really, really appreciate this. Always make decisions that open more doors. As we sort of shift a little bit, I want to see if we can sort of probe on some of those crises moments, some of those leadership moments throughout your career. And would love if you could share one or two of those moments that really shifted how you lead in your career, both or as an administrator as well as a full professor.
Yeah, and kind of thinking about this conversation, there were sort of several that came up, and as is obviously you two know this very well, leadership happens from formal positions and leadership happens from positions that are not named the lead person. So there was an incident that happened when I was working at Brown. I was an assistant dean, very low kind of in the hierarchy, but I was in the dean's office, and we had a group of students called Students on Financial Aid, SOFA, I think was their acronym. And it was a protest. At the time, Brown was not need blind. A couple other Ivies were need blind. They've gone back and forth over the years. So in terms of admissions, and who could be admitted. So there was a student activist moment, and the students took over the administration building. It's a small, very historic building, incidentally. And somehow we ended up inside the building before the students took over the building. I lose a little track of that exact detail about how that happened. But there we are, this group of deans kind of in the administration building, kind of barricaded in a room, essentially. As students were out in the hallways and they'd taken over the rotunda and all the buildings. And the board met in a room on the third floor of this building. And the day goes on, we're in the building. The president and his leadership team decided they wanted the president was out of town, they really wanted the students out of the building. And they were not going to kind of capitulate to this taking over the building and not negotiate with students while they're doing that. They were willing to have the conversations, but not under these conditions. So it was up to the student life office to remove the students from the building, as sometimes vice presidents of student affairs end up having to do. Yes. And Robin Rose, who was our dean and VP, another one of my mentors and all-time favorite human beings, Robin was sort of in charge of this and made the incredibly difficult decision that we were, after lots of conversations with the student activists, who were like, no, we're not leaving voluntarily, that we would begin to arrest students, and conversations about, civil disobedience and peaceable protest. And if you're going to walk that line all the way as far as it can sometimes go, sometimes it leads to arrest, which was nobody's first choice, but that was the decision that came to. And it was thinking about the carceral state and lots of other kinds of things we think about now. Arrest can never be a humane process. The process of putting students under arrest and walking them out of the building to the buses to take them downtown Providence to be booked was as humane as it could have been, I believe, under the circumstances. And it was, every student had a choice. They could walk out voluntarily anytime. We talked a lot with students about if you're an international student, or if you're going to go to law school, or, if you're undocumented, or just making sure students knew as well as we could, help them understand what the consequences would be. And then each student was escorted down the stairs and out to the bus by a police officer on one side, a Brown University police officer, and somebody from the student life office. So I spent several hours walking down the stairs and out to the bus with students. And I get emotional when I talk about this. It is one of the defining days of my life as I wasn't the person in charge. I didn't make the decision. I also was a student who was able to afford college because of, at the time, they didn't call them Pell Grants yet, but it was the Pell Grant and student financial aid and grants from my college. And I was these same students. I was the people who would not have been able to go to college under other circumstances because of my family's financial situation. So, there I am, a young assistant dean, walking students down to be arrested. And I 1,000% disagreed with this decision. I could not have disagreed more with it. And it was my job. And I decided I don't think I would have been fired if I'd walked out and said I won't do it. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Robin gave us a choice and said nobody has to do this, as I kind of play back through that night. But being there to make sure that the process was as smooth as possible was sort of part. And I tell the story as this really crucible moment in my thinking about the work of student affairs and the difficult positions that we sometimes end up in as leaders, and then also people who are parts of organizations that aren't always behaving in ways that we wish they would or could, or in our hearts know could have been different. And that moment for me really set me on a path of thinking about how does one lead in that moment with, senior leadership, most senior leadership saying, I want them out of the building by midnight, get them out. And vice president who said, okay, that is what we're going to do. And then thinking through contributing from the point in the organization where I was able to do that piece of leadership. So that's really one of the core moments for me in my whole identity as a professional.
One, I appreciate you for sharing that story, because those moments that define us, there's something that either breaks or is formed within us, something that's cultivated that sticks with us for every future leadership season. But I want to just ask a couple of questions about that, because you didn't agree with the decision. Those students possessed an identity or identities that you resonated with. When you were walking with those students, were they asking questions? Like, what was that moment for you? You said that you were there to make sure that their arrests were as humane as they could be, right? But what was going through your mind through every walk, going down those steps with those folks that you identified with?
And thanks for that question, Tomika. I identified with them. I knew a whole bunch of them because I was working with queer student activists and women activists and like lots of stuff. So, and some of them were not going to have the conversation. Others were asking questions like, well, how can you do this? How can you? We thought you were one of us. You are a traitor. You're fascist. Which I was like, oh, I am a lot of things. Fascist happens not to be one of them, but gosh. But you're a traitor. You're a tool of the man. How can you do this? And beyond just saying, well, I'm doing my job. I'm following orders, but to say like, I'm here because I believe in the work you're doing and I trust the immediate senior leadership in the Division of Student Affairs that there are going to be conversations and that the university is going to take you seriously. And I know you don't believe that because you are, you took a very serious action and you're taking a personal risk of the arrest to make this because you don't believe the university will take you seriously otherwise. So some of it was, really angry students. They were angry, tired. They've been in the building all day. And then other students, I think there were some who were like, sorry, Chris, to make you go through this. But it didn't feel to me like the moment to be like in the kind of solidarity that says, hey, look, I got Pell Grant. I'm still paying my student loans here. I'm one of you. Like I did not, I think a slightly younger version of me that night would have sort of tried to form an alliance. But in some forming crystallization of professional maturity, I knew that wasn't the right thing to do. I don't think I could have described it well. I just was like, don't go there, Chris. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there were some different conversations with people. And I'll say the police officers as well. It was the Brown University police who were not armed at the time. I don't know if they are now, but we had a lot of student life work real closely with them as well. So these were colleagues as well, the police officers. And, many of them came from families where, people in their families who went to college were there on financial aid and those things. Yeah, there were a lot of tough conversations.
And, in those tough conversations, as you described, you couldn't make it about you. You had these relationships. Your presence had almost like a dichotomous purpose, right? You're there to protect them and to have some sense of protection to the best of your ability with all of the limitations and restrictions that were in that space. And at the same time, you were also there because it was your job. And I think that's one of the things that is very difficult about student affairs work, because we are relational. We are there to promote student success. We're there to bring the best out of them, ensure that they're having all of these life experiences to make them better. And we build that relationship. And then there comes times where we then become not the fascist, but the enforcer. right? The person reminds you of the policy and brings you back. And it's so difficult because you almost have to weigh out not your morals, but like your pride and your sense of responsibility. To whom am I responsible for in this moment? And so I appreciate your story because it highlights some of the tension that if folks have not experienced a crisis where the folks you care about, those students that you're passionate about, and you have that relationship, you're watching them face consequences of a personal decision that has well justifiable means, well justifiable reasons why it's happening. But there are consequences sometimes to civil disobedience. And there are consequences to activism. And even though we don't like it, it doesn't mean that they are not present. Tell us about what happened after that. So the students go and they are arrested, they get off the bus. What happens on their return to campus in that story?
Don't actually know the exact when they came back to campus because I was still up on campus sending busloads down a hill. It happens to be down a hill. I know the aftermath in our division, in our office with a group of deans who worked together. And this was a group, we had high trust in each other, really high trust. And that was where some of those conversations around the ickiness of it, right? Like just the like this feels terrible. Did we do the right thing? Did we have any other choice in this context? And how do we face these students now? When I go to my next student meeting, you know, I'm working, we didn't really have an LGBT center at the time. It was an office. I was like, how do I go to that office for my office hours there when there are students there who we arrested or had arrested, I guess. So there was a lot of kind of figuring out how do we move forward with any sense of credibility with these students. So there's a lot of thinking about can you rebuild trust with students, and in what ways did this situation strain maybe the trust among ourselves as a group in what we were asking each other to do and to live through. And not everybody in the group, certainly everybody in the group would sympathize with the issues around economic access and things, but not everybody in the group had that experience themselves as undergrads. Like not everybody in that group would have been in the boardroom protesting. So I think that was also a piece of it too, and sort of each of us coming to terms with where we fit with questions of wealth and inequity around wealth on the campus we were working at, which was an exceptionally wealthy campus where there were some unbelievably wealthy students as well as very students who were very poor. So it was kind of a time of reckoning around those issues as well.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Tomika. Element 451 is hosting the AI Engage Summit on October 29th and 30th. This free virtual event features many of your favorite Enrollify creators and will explore AI's impact on student engagement, enrollment marketing, and institutional success. Learn how to tap into the power of AI to enhance student communications, personalize the admissions process, and support at-risk students. Plus, hear directly from current students on how AI is influencing their engagement in campus life. The AI Engage Summit is your guide to understanding and applying AI at your school. Registration is free. Visit element451.com to save your spot. Now back to the show.
I'm with Tomika. This is really a very powerful and really vulnerable story, and I'm really appreciative that you brought us back to that time in student affairs. I want to ask you to come back to this question and ask if there's any moments while you've been in academic affairs and perhaps how those are different and what uniquely was different about that role, obviously on the other side of the house, if you will, but also just in the roles that you play through the full professorship.
So I was lucky to be mentored in my academic life, by the folks at Boston College, but also by, some other leaders in the field, Gary Rhodes and Bill Tierney, Estelle Ben-Simon, and folks who remind faculty importantly and constantly that tenure is not to be squandered. Certainly not taken for granted, because anymore, like the tenure faculty is becoming a smaller proportion, but it's as much of a duty as it is a privilege. And it is not responsible to accept the privilege of it without really seriously taking on the duty. So Michigan State University has had a series of leadership crises over the past several years. We're on our 7th president in 6 years, or it's a little even hard to keep. I think that's right. 7th president in 6 years, 5th provost in 5 minutes, something. It's been a lot. And the turnover has been tumultuous, and it began with a massive tragedy of Larry Nassar, the gymnastics doctor, sexually abusing girls and women. And the number of times in the leadership crises we've had, and then of late in the last year and a half, our board of trustees has been ungoverned and unable to govern, and has led to presidential transition. The obligation of tenured faculty to be able to stand up and say, this isn't right, and to find voices in academic governance to say this isn't right in ways that I know as administrators can't do. Like, there are literally times when I'm like, well, I know you, my friend in student affairs, I know you can't say it this way, either because of your role or because you plan to have a continued career in leadership and higher education that isn't tenured. Like, yeah, sure, you could say this and you might not be fired by Michigan State, but are you going to become a vice president? Like, that story's going to get out and you're not going to get hired for vice presidency somewhere else, right? So I have come to see in my work, and I work in the administrative academic affairs administration work I work with a gifted group of leaders, most of whom are what I would call career administrators, many of whom came through student affairs, now work in our academic affairs office on student success as assistant vice provost and whatnot. But they're career administrators. And I love that they brought student affairsness into that realm, because every now and then our vice provost of undergraduate education, who's a good friend, he'll say things like he's just discovered that, like, I don't know, not an exact example, but like he just discovered that, like, students drink their residence halls on weekends. Let me be clear. He knew that. But that kind of example that, like, every now and then you hear from an academic administrator, you're like, yes? Have you stepped in a residence hall? But my career administrator friends, several of them come through housing and these kinds of things, there is stuff that, because they want to continue their careers as administrators, they can and can't say at different times, versus Vice Provost Mark and me as tenured faculty. But he's in a vice provost role, so there's, again, things that he would not say, but I could say them. And there were times in particularly the stuff with our board of trustees in the last year and a half. I was giving a talk at an award ceremony, and I was actually able to say out loud, like, this is board overstep. They are out of line. And I remember the president was the then president was, I don't know, maybe 10 feet behind me, sitting next to one of the trustees, and I was like, somebody's got to say it. So the ability to say and name some things that have to be said and named because tenured faculty can do that thing and have to do that thing. When that kind of overreach happened, my colleague Brendan Cantwell and I organized a teach-in on academic governance, because so many people at Michigan State didn't understand why what the trustees did was not right. And we're like, no, that's because we haven't fully exercised our governance muscles here, and we need to learn what they are. And so we organized this teach-in, which is a very academic thing to do. We'll have a teach-in. But at the teach-in, we need to be able to talk about the ways that having a board that overreaches it's not just a breach of shared governance into faculty life, but the huge host of administrators who don't have a voice, a say. They're not represented anywhere in Michigan State's governance system. Like, not that the tenured faculty have to, like, we're not protecting them and we're not speaking for them, but we have to speak. And we have to speak that they don't have a voice so that we can begin to make this kind of change. And that's the kind of thing that being able to say and be like, this is being zoomed out all over the place. I know half the trustees who I'm accusing of overstepping or listening in on the call. I don't care. You got to say the things. So I think that would be a real difference. And again, going back to those mentors who would say, it's not just a privilege, there's absolute duty. Like, there's no point in having tenure if you don't do these things when they're needed.
There's so many discussions and attacks on tenure. There's so many discussions about decreased shared governance and emphasis on it within higher education right now. What I appreciate about your story is that you kind of shared how there can be a synergistic relationship depending on our framing of the responsibility and the duty that you glean from your mentors, in tenured faculty standing with administrators, having more protections to be able to say certain things. And I think we can all agree that there are some administrators who feel emboldened and are courageous, and they will say the thing just like the tenure faculty member. We know we have both of that exist on our campuses. But one of the things I'm interested in is when we approach this from an equity lens, because shared governance, it just looks different for every campus, every culture. I think back to like all the classes about higher education administration and teaching it and learning it and then living it are three different things. When you think about an equity approach to shared governance and even a decision making from either your academic leadership realm or like your senior leadership realm, what comes to mind when the word equity comes into play when making these decisions for our campuses and making sure that we are respecting and valuing the voices of both our faculty, whether they're tenured or not, and also valuing the voice of our administrators, especially those whose careers have been built in higher ed? How do we think about that through an equity lens?
It's such a great question. And I flash back to Dimitri Morgan and Felicia Commodore sort of talking about like looking at equity with boards and getting really sort of equity mindsets. And I'm thinking of like Estella Ben Simon's work on like really, equity minded leadership, and thinking about having to, I think sometimes about acting with integrity as an equity minded leader, instructor, community member, having to have maybe one analogy is lots of lenses or maybe lots of antennae, the ability to hold multiple equity-related issues, whether it's gender equity, racial equity, social class equity, a whole host of facets of ways in which higher education is inequitable and in fact, perpetuates inequity. So thinking about like a host of topics and issues, and then thinking about it, maybe it's like a Rubik's Cube, where you've got sort of one face of it is these sort of facets, dimensions of equity, and then institutional and organizational levels, and being able to see with three dimensions through our organizations to see where are the places in the organization that perpetuate and create inequities, and thinking about how do we shift that landscape to make it different. An analogy I've been using in some of my work is that, mostly in student success work, but I think it works in other equity ways in higher ed. Like if we see somebody is not succeeding, it's kind of like a person who's drowning in the ocean and you can like throw a life jacket at them, right? Like, here, take this life raft. And that's an approach. And we need to do that while there are people going under. But if you thought about reshaping the shoreline so that there wasn't an undertow, like what is it like to reshape our organizations so they're not sucking people down? That's the next way of thinking about equity for me. It's like, what structurally policy infrastructure needs to change so that the next group of people aren't going to go and we're not going to have to go out with life jackets. And then the third way is to think about, if you change the salinity of the water, everybody floats. And what do we do to change the larger ethos? Like as we are working around addressing systemic racism, which would be maybe changing the salinity, like how do we continue to work at the broadest macro levels so that while we are reshaping the shoreline to make our organizations less toxic, less dangerous, but how do we work at all these multiple levels in our decisions, in our policies, actively looking at all the ways that we have created undertow for people? Like that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
Chris, the research that you've done over the years, going back to the Spencer grant that you got to study women's colleges and universities, and even the sort of current work, I wonder if you could sort of share some of the more recent insights that you're seeing, because when you're talking about the ethos of the institution, not that long ago, Kevin Kruger, now the former president and CEO of NASPA, was on another podcast of some colleagues of ours on Student Affairs Now, and he talked about the stratification of the field, that the field is actually breaking in terms of its ethos of attitudes and belonging, that people are fleeing places like Florida and Texas, but they're also going. and making this. And he talked about that the field is really shifting into this polarized structure within the actual professionals. And what I wonder is, from that point of talking about changing the ethos, what is the research that you're seeing, and what are the sort of like approaches that you're seeing that are helping us to interrogate, like from a reflexive perspective, in our personal roles and our professional roles in changing those ethoses?
I haven't yet watched that episode of Student Affairs Now with Kevin on it.
Yeah.
My first response is I got to put that on my list for the weekend. Where I think I'm seeing it is in some of the work that like Kevin McClure and colleagues have done around that kind of maybe originated in the Great Resignation, the COVID lockdown time, and the people leaving the field. So I think that's probably the closest kind of thing that I think about there. There are some generational shifts in what professionals of different, and I don't want to go like hard into like generational stereotypes, but there are some approaches to work and working that are different across generations. I can say, this isn't research, but my own students, are absolute, and who are now Gen Z, and whatever alpha is that after, we'll start seeing them soon enough. I will say that the late millennial Gen Z, and I think the pandemic intervention into their young adult lives, I think there is some pushback coming against maybe those of us in Gen X who, I like to say, like, we gave the world grind culture and the early millennials gave you hustle culture. And I'm really sorry, Gen Z, that you got stuck with having to push back on hustle and grind, but it's what we gave you. There's some pushback around some of the values that have kept our field going forward. And some of those values are that you always do more with less, and that you always say that you're told to jump, you say how high. You don't ever say, should we still be jumping? So I think that some of the values in our field that I've lived as a professional, that allowed me to succeed as a professional, that happened to match my personality really well as a professional, they are rejecting some of those ideas and challenging us as a field a bit around that. So it's not research-based, and when I talk with my colleagues at other student affairs graduate programs, they're definitely seeing this in their students as well. And when I talk to supervisors of graduate students and early career professionals, I think we're seeing the same thing. And the gift in that pushback is the invitation, if not the imperative, for us to really look hard at those values in the field and why we hold them, and actually see if they should be there. The challenge, of course, is that we are a field that has adapted like an ecological organism. We have adapted to survive, if not thrive, on understaffing, underpaid people willing to do it because they love students. So I think that that's the challenge to us, is to confront a little bit of that past. And then the challenge for our leadership is going to be, maybe they do need to figure out how to make the case for more resources to the institution. Like, if they're understaffed and underpaid, like, not just, the new professionals are unhappy. That's not the point. The point is that we adapted to be a field that relies on a bit of inhumanity in our expectations of our employees. That isn't sustainable for the field.
I really enjoy that response, because the changes that we have made, and one point you said with this low paying and just accepting things that are just inequitable at their very core. And we've built an entire career and expectations that if the job is low paying, you deal with it. If you're experiencing a campus that has these components that need to be shifted, you just have to adapt to it. And there's the debates that happen in our classrooms and master's and higher education doctoral programs. There's also the debates that happen at the conferences, but somehow we still are recruiting people into this profession. We are providing resources to retain and grow them professionally. And so we've created almost this cycle of protection around things that need to be disrupted. But it's interesting, because where does that disruption come from? That's what, when you were talking, that's all I was thinking about is, man, so where's the disruption to kind of this way that really isn't right, and we can critique it. But it makes me also think about James Baldwin when he talked about, I can critique America because I love the country so much, right? So for me, I think about that lens. We can critique higher ed because we study it, we live it, we're committed to the field. As we come to a close, one of the things I think would be helpful, and I really want to name the impact of preparing professionals in the work that you do. You have, you've supervised, you've taught, you've researched. But I think one thing that would be helpful is to provide some type of actionable strategies that those of us who are serving as mentors or supervisors or faculty members of that next generation of higher ed leaders, what are some strategies that you can provide to the audience for us to grapple with or consider or apply on what we can do to improve the condition of the field? I don't think that we have the hard conversations that we do a theoretical approach to a very practical experience. But what are some of the strategies that you can share with us that would be helpful in us thinking about really helping to benefit the field more?
So when I think about how we prepare new professional, grad students and new professionals, I have said in some other places, I'm educating my students who will graduate in 2026, the new cohort that just came in. They'll work until, 2076. The students they greet in 2076 are going to be living full productive lives to 2126, right? So we are, the work we do in our graduate programs is 100-year work, right? We are preparing people who will be preparing people for 100 years from now, directly. So thinking about what it means to take that long view. And for me, some of what it means is, you just said to me about that, the practice and the theory part. And some of it for me has been being a little less uptight about, do you need to have them memorize? Do they need to know all the steps in the stadium of all the things? Maybe not. Maybe that's not the priority. To be clear, I never quiz them on the steps and stages of all the theories. But being more clear with them, what I want you to understand are these underlying principles of how student development happens, because it is going to look different over time. The populations we're looking at over time are going to be different. And I want you to think about, how do you put these principles to practice, and where do you see them in your practice? So some of it is, again, maybe Chris Wren, can be a little less uptight about student development theory, which tells you something. It has taken me several years to get there. Not an easy thing for me to do. So I think that's one piece of it, is rethinking, I guess, what we most value and what we most emphasize in our teaching. So that's a little piece of the classroom part of it. And I think, how do we create some feedback loops from our grad students and new professionals into the conversations that more senior leaders are having? It doesn't mean inviting the first year hall director to sit with the vice president's council necessarily, but it does mean creating spaces where we take seriously their voices and experiences, and having a systematic way to do that. Having a university-wide, council of academic advisors that has advisors from early career to senior that can meet and talk about quality of life for advising. And then not just, in the olden days, we would make that into a report in a white 3-ring binder, and it would sit on a shelf. We all know those shelves full of white 3-ring binders, right? But how do we create formal pathways for that feedback to affect our systems and our HR systems, as well as our training development and onboarding systems? So I think from a classroom perspective, rethinking how we're teaching, but then from a campus-wide system perspective, really thinking about how to more seriously, if it can't be part of the formal governance system, can we build it into our infrastructure for our leadership and structuring of these kinds of roles, so that we can take, so it's not the senior folks sitting around saying, oh, the young ones are whining again, and the young ones sitting around saying the senior ones don't listen to us. So I think, we've been doing that for the whole time I've been in the field. So how about we try something different that creates a more purposeful, serious pathway for those conversations to happen?
I like the purposeful part.
Yeah, I do too. Chris, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the episode today, and just really thankful for your time with us. That's wrapping up today's episode of After Further Consideration. We, as guests and hosts, hope this conversation has sparked some new ideas and provided some valuable insights for your own work in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion on your campus and beyond, whether you are academic affairs or student affairs or otherwise. That wraps up today's episode of After Further Consideration. We hope our conversation has sparked new ideas and provided valuable insights for your own work in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion on your campus and beyond.
Thank you for listening in. Remember, fostering meaningful change is a journey. Be encouraged and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in creating a more inclusive educational environment. After Further Consideration is a part of the Enrollify Podcast Network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too.
Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional.
Our shows feature a selection of the industry's best as your host. Learn from Brian Piper, Allison Tercio, Eddie Francis, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed.
Enrollify is presented by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.